China's entry into the world economy is the biggest economic shift of the 21st century. And the company that has probably taken the biggest advantage of that shift is Apple. In little more than 2 decades, the inventor of the iPod and the iPhone went from making almost none of its products in the People's Republic to being highly dependent on a complex and sophisticated supply chain consisting largely of Chinese companies. At the same time, it unlocked a vast market for its product. In the next few years, the company's sales in Greater China are set to exceed $80 billion, according to analyst forecasts. Now, that large and highly profitable relationship is under threat. Rising geopolitical tensions, and specifically Donald Trump's trade war, raise existential questions about Apple's ability to keep producing ever more sophisticated smartphones, laptops, and other devices in China. More broadly, Apple is the exemplar of several bigger questions. Can the US meaningfully reduce its dependence on imports from China? Can it bring highly complex and sophisticated manufacturing back onshore? What would such a shift mean for American dominance of the global technology industry in the era of artificial intelligence? And what are the implications for US tech firms, specifically Apple, a $3 trillion behemoth that is currently the world's second largest company? So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of Apple in China. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest stories in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. To tackle this topic, I'm delighted to welcome Patrick McGee onto the show. Patrick has spent the past 2 years researching and writing a new book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. He covered Apple as a journalist for the Financial Times in San Francisco, and previously reported for the newspaper from Frankfurt and from Hong Kong, which is where I first got to know him. Before we get started, I should add that Apple says the book is untrue and full of inaccuracies, and that the company did not check any facts before publication. Also, we recorded this conversation before the US and China reached a temporary deal to lower punitive tariffs on each other's exports. So, with those disclaimers out of the way, let's dig in. Patrick McGee, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
So there's lots to talk about with this book, but let's start by zooming out a little bit, because it seems to me that the story of Apple and China is in many ways a sort of microcosm of the relationship between the US and China, the opening up of the Chinese economy, China joining the WTO, becoming a manufacturing hub for companies like Apple. And I think it's easy looking back now to sort of say, well, this development was sort of somehow inevitable. But I wonder to what extent you think, having studied that history and that history with Apple in particular, was this kind of an accident, or was there some element of design there?
So first of all, just let me say, you're sort of hitting the nail on the head with what I was trying to achieve, which was like, I want the reader to come away knowing more about the US-China tech battle. I want them learning more about Chinese history. But the way to sort of get the layperson involved was to sell them on the sex appeal of Apple, right? So certainly, yeah, every page probably mentions, the 5 letters Apple. But the lessons and the experiences would certainly be shared by other people, other corporations, and so forth. So there's just sort of no better company to tell this story than through the company that both cracked the retail market more than anybody else, right? About $70 billion of revenue. I mean, that's more than entire sectors, let alone other companies. And of course, they certainly, built the world's most efficient supply chain over the last quarter century. Now, when you say, was this inevitable, are you talking about sort of the authoritarian turn, like as in China was not going to become a democracy, or something else?
Oh, no, well, that's another question. No, I was thinking more about the sort of the way in which a company like Apple ended up becoming so dependent on China as a source of manufacturing, and also, as you say, as a market.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my narrative is that I don't put any blame on anyone at Apple for originally moving to China in the early 2000s. I mean, if anything, Apple is late to the game there.
Right.
I mean, really, that once you get past the introduction, the origins or the first chapters of the book are really very much in 1996, when Apple is the last holdout. You know, if you include it in the PC industry, everybody else has moved to Asia, and they certainly moved to outsourcers. And you know that there's that product cycle where you have an Apple where, you know, they didn't invent the first MP3 player or the first smartphone or the first tablet, but they just did a better job than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically the question for supply chain. So they're late to outsourcing, they're late to China, and yet what they are able to do there, what they see. You know, I make this distinction between the likes of Dell saw China and looked at what was available, and Apple saw what was possible. So they totally reorient how they're going to build computers and how intricate and complex they can be, understanding that we've got armies of laborers that can sort of execute whatever it is we come up with, right? So I like to joke, like, what's your favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s? And then watch people try to even think about a Dell computer in the early 2000s. I mean, there's just no equivalent of Johnny Ive at any of these other companies. And so Apple just takes advantage of it so well. It's probably going off on a little bit of a tangent, but the sort of counterfactual that I think about all the time, but I don't really include in the book, is what would have happened if, you know, we didn't lobby for China to enter the WTO.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is there a possibility that the sort of integrated supply chain across the world that, you know, was completely different from the Soviet Union was doing? Like, they were not allowed in that supply chain, right? You think about someone like a Margaret Thatcher or a Ronald Reagan. You know, these people are free traders, but they were not advocating that we trade with the USSR. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is totally possible that we could have treated China as a country that needed to be isolated until they really made their changes to, you know, towards a more small L liberal society. And instead, we had a different idea, probably an arrogant one, that they're going to integrate and become more middle class and sort of probably overthrow to communist power to some extent on their own. Was that a big mistake? I feel like it's sort of a question too big for me to write in a corporate history, but I suspect it probably was. And I mean, I would love to, you know, have the chance. Obviously, it's hypothetical and you could never do it, but to see if that was possible. Like, all of the investment Apple and the rest of the world made into China, what would have happened if that had gone into Mexico and you had NAFTA on steroids by now instead?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. But let's leave that for another time, perhaps.
Sure.
I mean, one thing I'm curious about. I mean, you mentioned that Apple was late to get into the sort of the Chinese manufacturing game, and companies have been going there for decades. I mean, I remember my mother going to China. She used to teach English to business people, going to China in the 1980s to teach English to Chinese engineers who were part of a TV manufacturing joint venture with Philips, the Dutch electronics company. You know, and that was happening. So that was happening from very early on. But the key thing strikes me is that most of those companies who went to China went in through joint ventures, or were in some ways were required to go in through joint ventures. So there was this sort of explicit setup. And I just wonder, how did Apple manage to avoid that structure?
You know, it's really interesting because I'm not sure they were explicitly avoiding the idea of a joint venture. It's just that other companies were doing their own manufacturing and they were happy to do it in joint ventures. Whereas Apple was doing more the Taiwanese model, where they were working with the contract manufacturers, and it was they themselves, the Taiwanese, that were moving over to the mainland. So something like the first iPod was built in Taiwan by a company called Inventec. Apple's relationship with them goes back a few years because Inventec was the company in Taiwan that was chosen to build the Newton, you know, the sort of 1990s failure, but in a certain sense, a proto iPhone, if you will, at least a proto BlackBerry, second generation of which was designed by Johnny Ive. And so they were basically operating under the radar. In other words, it's not that they didn't have a joint venture, but they did have, you know, a wholly owned foreign subsidiary that said Apple and had a bit in fruit outside. There was none of that. They were just orchestrating events from afar and really operating under the radar to such an extent that when they become wildly successful by the time Xi Jinping enters office, I mean, Beijing does not understand what Apple is doing. It thinks of it as an exploitative company. It's just not clear what value Apple is adding. And in a sense, the thesis-driven part of the narrative, which is really part 5, right? There's a lot of foundation building before we get there, is Apple's realization that we need to put our operations into a language that Beijing will understand and appreciate. And then there's like a political charm offensive, if you will, to go directly to Zhongnanhai, the sort of equivalent of the White House in China, and really get the message out that we are really like up-arming your entire electronics industry. We're not a company you're going to want on a blacklist anytime soon. We're actually a massive supporter of Chinese indigenous innovation.
And we should definitely get back to that.
That's the thesis.
But I just sort of just on that sort of the early days of that manufacturing. I mean, obviously, the way Apple goes in is as just from the way you've written it is it goes in through this Taiwanese company, largely through this Taiwanese company called Foxconn, actually called Honhai Precision Industry, but and it's sort of and that's the way that it kind of establishes itself in China, or at least or the manufacturing side of the business.
I was going to say, because the channels business, selling through third parties, is actually the first business, and that's set up in 1993.
But from the manufacturing point of view, Foxconn is obviously very important in this story. So just talk a bit about how that evolved.
So Foxconn, if you talk to people in the early and mid 90s, is a company that Apple people know, but they know it as the connector company. So Fox is just an animal that Terry Guo, the founder, likes. Con refers to connectors. So they're, they're making things that go inside your computer. They're not doing the assembly, and it's kind of low value. But Terry Guo founds the company in a shed in 1974, right 2 years before two guys named Steve found Apple in California. And he really is just smart and savvy, and is getting a better understanding. And he's sort of thinking about something like the knob of a television, right? Building those, molding those, and then figuring out what they connect to and doing the next thing. And so he's sort of becoming more vertically integrated with time. And then by the time Taiwan and China, or maybe I should say Taipei and Beijing, sort of relax restrictions on travel, I think that's 1987, Terry Guo really is among the first Taiwanese businessmen to go set up operations in China. And, and Shenzhen in particular, north of Shenzhen. We would call it Shenzhen now. It wasn't Shenzhen at the time. And he does something wild, which is that he needs these migrant laborers, migrant meaning, people from the Chinese hinterland, so migrants in their own country, to come live in the city. But I mean, it's so poorly developed at the time that he makes the wild decision to actually build apartment complexes. It ends up having shopping centers and basketball courts and massage parlors and entertainment venues all within a little city that eventually it has hundreds of thousands of people living there, right? And it's an American-sized city, something like a Boston, certainly something like a Salt Lake City, but in an area that's really quite dense and not very large. And Terry, I think the people that think one of the things that people don't understand about Terry Guo is it's not just that he's doing better than Inventec or Quanta, these other sort of Taiwanese rivals, at the logistics and the electronics building. He's better at the political connections. And if you're operating in China, politics is everything. And so I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but it is sort of fascinating. If it's a little bit wonky, however, which is that the Taiwanese in the late 90s are all moving in the direction of original design manufacturing, ODM model. So that means that not only are you just taking the manufacturing orders from the PC industry, you're taking on the R&D and you're taking on the design. And so what you're doing is you're allowing the Western businesses to offload more and more of their fixed costs. And you, the Taiwanese company, are taking on higher margin activity. Now that requires more expensive engineers, but you're basically creating these catalogs and then giving it to Dell and saying, pick and choose which model you want next year. Terry doesn't do this. Terry wants to be an OEM. And this is at a time, original equipment manufacturer. And this is at a time when an OEM model is sort of shunned as low margin. But he's not interested in low margin assembly any more than the next guy is. He's sort of doing it the way that Costco sells hot dogs. It gets people in the door. And then he's going to make his money doing the vertical integration. So if he takes on more and more of your orders, he kind of lures you in, and then you're a little bit stuck because where else are you going to go if he's been doing this, that, and the other thing? So he moves heaven and earth to respond to your design demands, but he never competes with you on design and never tries to do any of the higher margin, R&D. And what that means, though, is that by taking on more and more of the adjacent tasks and being more vertically integrated, it means he needs more employees, he needs more land, and he gets more orders and creates this sort of virtual cycle. So if your if that's your model, you're working hand in glove, or at least he was working hand in glove with the Chinese government, right? Not at a federal level, but a provincial level. And that was his access to labor pools, to land, to machinery, to equipment, to buildings. And, people from the time, including people that work at Foxconn, say the Westerner will just never understand how easy it is to build factories in China. Like, if you've got the orders, if you've got the ambition, the Chinese government will do whatever they need to help you. And the caveat is you better fulfill your ambitions. You better, fulfill those orders.
Right.
But Foxconn understands better than anybody else in the late 1990s that if you're going to do this, Apple is the company to go with, because they are designing computers in a way that nobody else is. And so he's getting great engineering help from what becomes America's greatest company.
So I think, and obviously over time, as the iPhone comes along and develops and stuff, sort of people in the West gradually became aware through reporting of what was going on there, of these giant Foxconn cities and the as you say, the tens of thousands of people working there and the conditions in which they lived, and the sort of the kind of very draining and stressful and kind of repetitive jobs that they were doing. And obviously that becomes a bit of an issue. But I guess there was always a sense that from the Chinese point of view, this was all part of development, right? Because these people were coming off land from out of agriculture, subsistence agriculture, and this was a way to develop. So it's interesting when you said at a certain point, that the leadership in Beijing thought of China, thought of Apple as an exploitative company. So it's sort of interesting to me that the Chinese also didn't necessarily like that kind of development, or am I misunderstanding that?
Slight misunderstanding. There's two related issues. So one of them is in the introduction, and I have the line that our narrative, our understanding of Apple in China is remarkably narrow. I mean, the first report that you're talking about was actually in the Daily Mail, 2006. They do this investigative deep dive and talk to a bunch of people working at Foxconn who say it's like the military. I have to stand all day. Labor laws are supposed to be capped at 60 hours a week. I'm working 80 hours a week. I mean, really like astonishing stuff. And this begins the whole narrative of like the Apple works in sweatshops type situation. And I would say that begins a sort of cat and mouse pattern where for the last 20 years, essentially, different reporters have just gone to different suppliers of Apple, written essentially the same story. And then Apple sort of feels like, oh, we need to go audit this factory. Sometimes they put out a report acknowledging certain things, and then they pledge to improve. And this is basically what Apple in China reporting has been the last 20 years. It's a really important narrative, don't get me wrong. But I think we've totally failed to look at the strategy or the political maneuvering that Apple has actually done. The fact that Foxconn was basically doing all the political maneuvering on Apple's behalf until about 2013. And we can get to why 2013 is so significant. And then how Apple sort of takes it over by having senior people live in the country for the first time. So there's just like a totally unexplored narrative that is not to do with the tedium of a Foxconn job or other assembly jobs in the country. So I sort of flipped that on its head by saying it's not that Apple was exploiting Chinese workers. It's that Beijing was allowing Apple to exploit Chinese workers so that Beijing could in turn exploit Apple. And if that needs to be spelled out, I'm referring to technology transfer. Beijing begins to understand how much they are learning writ large from Apple, just across the whole sector. To such an extent that I make the argument that the iPhone didn't kill Nokia. Chinese imitations of the iPhone killed Nokia, and the reason the imitations were so good is Apple trained all of their suppliers. So that's the first half of the answer. The second half, I'll keep it much shorter, is that because Apple is operating under the radar until 2013, when Xi Jinping is elected, elected, but not by the populace, but by the party, it's not clear what Apple is up to. Again, nobody senior living in the country. They're not the ones doing the negotiating for the deals. A city like iPhone City is in Zhengzhou, and they, I think, have around 400,000 workers. I mean, that was all orchestrated by Foxconn. That was a wily bet by Terry Guo, where Apple legitimately wasn't involved. It sounds crazy that they weren't involved because they're such a detail-oriented company, but they just weren't really thinking in that sense, and they had Terry to be able to do it. So if you were just looking at public data, then you would see something like, hey, wait a minute, Foxconn, the chief assembler of Apple products, was actually making in raw dollars more money than Apple in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, I think 2004 as well. And they're making margins that at the start of the century are more than 10%. Then the iPhone, or first the iPod and then the iPhone come on board. And Apple margins go from 1% to 25%. Like revenues in a period of about a decade literally go up by about 60,000%, okay, from tens of millions to tens of billions. And it doesn't look like they're sharing the wealth, because that is not the case at Foxconn. I don't remember the specific years, but there's a 5-year period where Foxconn revenues double from roughly 50 billion to 100 billion. And in that period, their profits go up by a mere tens of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at public data and you're a Beijing official, it does not look like Apple is in China for China, to use their phrase.
Right.
And so it's private data, a private understanding that Apple has to come up with to sort of convince Beijing, you're looking at this all wrong. And I think they're so successful in that Beijing begins to understand that the joint venture model that they've always championed is far inferior to the Apple model, to such an extent that once Apple makes this clear, Tesla is welcomed with open arms to set up the first non-JV auto company in China, right? The first JV is 1984, Volkswagen. And in 2019, Tesla opens a factory. And Tesla deliberately adopts the Apple model, literally hires Apple engineers. And within a few years, we're off to the races of EVs for the first time after 20 years, becoming wildly successful in China. And people tend to think Tesla inspired, sort of changed the game on what an EV could be, what it looked like. It was a marketing effort. And I think that's partly true. I don't want to say that's nonsense, but it's nonsense if that's the whole story. What really happened is Tesla had engineers doing what Apple did, which was going to all the suppliers' factories, BYD, CATL, teaching them, training them, auditing, supervising, improving the quality of those components. And then, of course, what did they do? They sold them to BYD and other Chinese companies. So the influence that Apple had on China is absolutely immense. And the other Western company that sort of realized this and took advantage of it and worked with officials in Shanghai is Tesla.
So I want to get into the dependence of Apple on China, but just to play forward that analogy a little bit. I mean, we're obviously now in a situation where Tesla is in some trouble for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into. I think people are aware of. And the Chinese manufacturers have sort of eaten its lunch in China and are eating its lunch elsewhere. Probably apart from the US, because the US is keeping them out. Is that something that could happen to Apple as well? Could we foresee a situation where sort of the companies that have been part of the Apple supply chain sort of rise up and you talked about them sort of killing Nokia, smartphone manufacturers killing Nokia. Can we imagine them rising up and sort of replacing Apple at some point as well? I
mean, if there were not a national security risk with Huawei right now, right. I would own the Huawei Mate XT, which unfolds twice into a 10.2-inch tablet equivalent to an iPad, and is just a miracle of industrial engineering and design and shipment. I mean, it's phenomenal. I do think we're at a stage where the Chinese phones are better than the iPhones in terms of hardware. And the reasons they're not making headway here is you've got, 20 years or so of lock-in, right? The whole blue message phenomenon and a whole bunch of features we don't need to go into. But, if you've been taking photographs since the first iPhone, you've got a whole library that you don't necessarily want to give up. Transferring it is maybe possible, but it's arduous. People sort of lock into their iOS ecosystem the way that, you keep the religion you're born with kind of situation, right? Transitioning is hard. So there's that. The other thing is that I can't go to an AT&T or any other store here and buy a Huawei. I don't get into this in the book, but I'm pretty confident, and sources have told me that the reason you can't buy a Huawei is basically Washington has told any of the major telecom groups here, you're going to be in a lot of trouble if we start seeing Huawei posters and Huawei phones in your stores. That's a different game in Europe. I mean, you're in London. Maybe you can buy Huawei there. You can certainly buy Honor, which is a subsidiary spun out of Huawei. And when I was living in Germany in the late 2010s, I did own a Huawei. They had a camera co-developed by Leica, a monochrome lens, and it was a phenomenal piece of hardware. And that was almost a decade ago. So, it's not so different from the EV thing, right? Even before Trump came in, Biden had put 100% tariffs on Chinese-made EVs. Yeah. And I think it's not a tariff question with why Xiaomi and Huawei phones aren't here, but it's other political obstacles. And maybe I should just mention the most obvious one, which is that Huawei was put on the entity list and no longer has access to things like Google services, which doesn't matter so much in the Chinese market where they're very big, but it does matter over here. And so they've developed their own OS, right, competing with Android, competing with iOS, called Harmony OS. And I don't know this for a fact, but my assumption is that Harmony OS is going to become the de facto standard for every Chinese smartphone maker in a matter of years. Then if they begin to export that around the world, that would be a really surreptitious and sort of brilliant way to export the Chinese version of the internet, right? Into developing countries, into Southeast Asia, into Russia, into Indonesia. So I think there's all sorts of unknowns over the next few years. But the most obvious place where Apple is going to hurt and has already seen 2.5 years of continual decline is in China, because that's where they're competing most directly with these Chinese companies.
Right. So let's talk about that then, because you mentioned at the outset, I think, what did you say, $70 billion of revenue in China that they're generating, which is incredible. So Apple is a huge market. Sorry, China is a huge market for Apple. Obviously, also a huge sort of source of supply chain and manufacturing and so forth. You say you say Apple has bound its future to a ruthless authoritarian state. Obviously, we're now in a situation where these geopolitical tensions have come to the fore, tariffs, trade wars, etc. How do you sort of see that playing out? Is there a scenario where Apple has to withdraw, kind of become smaller in China? I don't know. What do you think the future looks like?
So if there was an easy answer to this question, my book wouldn't be very compelling, because my point is Apple is stuck. There is no easy out here.
Right.
And the person leading the company, Tim Cook, is the person who orchestrated this policy.
Right.
Again, I don't blame him in 1998 for beginning to look at outsourcing. And I don't blame him for early 2000s of diversifying into China and then consolidating into China. I think it was a big mistake in 2013 to double down, to triple down, to quadruple down in China over the previous 12 years or the next 12 years from 2013. That's a point where, and I don't say so in the book. The book really, if you've read it, the tone is not argumentative. It's certainly not ideological. So in interviews, I can be more open as to sort of what my arguments are, but the book itself really doesn't contain any of that. So if the book was more like that, then what I would point out is I think it's 2013 that under pressure from Carl Icahn, Apple begins shareholder buybacks. And so buying their own stock, which essentially artificially increases their own assets, their own stock price. And they purchase, Apple, more than $100 billion of their stock each year. That's roughly equivalent to the top 6 or 7 Wall Street banks' buyback schemes combined. If over the last 10 years you were instead doing, let's say, half of that, and the other half was a supply chain resilience program where you were legitimately building real operations, not just assembly, real operations in India, and sort of trying to create a bifurcated supply chain, that I think would have been phenomenal. I don't even think they're really doing that now. I mean, that's something they should have been doing 12, 13 years ago. We have the sense that they're doing that now, and I think it's incorrect. If you think of it like this, there's sort of like 1,000 steps to make an iPhone, and Apple's making a concerted effort for the final step to be in India. And that's purely to avoid tariffs. Yeah. That is not to de-risk from China. If you buy a phone next year, an iPhone, and it says made in India, great. That is no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other iPhone you've ever purchased. So I think Apple needs to radically accelerate the depth and breadth of making components and whatnot in India. Of course, the trouble with that is the political backlash from Beijing. And Beijing can be clever about this kind of stuff. Is the reason a couple factories lose electricity on a random Wednesday because of the news story that they're diversifying into India? Apple gets put in a position where it's like, are those related? Who have we pissed off? How do we rectify this? I think they're in a situation where they're not going to be able to know what moves are. The CCP is just a very opaque organization, and Apple's been negotiating with them for a while, but negotiating in ways that have been quite helpful to China. Once they become the poster child, if indeed they do, of de-risking from the country, you're going to have problems with Beijing, but you're also going to have problems with the Chinese consumer, who have long correctly viewed the iPhone as an indigenous product. And the more and more there's India developments, the more and more you're going to see problems there. So yeah, there's no easy way out. And I think what they're doing in India is more hand waving than anything substantial.
So, but why is that? Because, the sort of the US-China relationship has been, heading south for, a good 10 years, certainly since Donald Trump got elected for the first time. The whole debate about decoupling, de-risking, has been going on for around the same length of time. Obviously, it's come to a head now. You have tariffs on, vast tariffs on Chinese imports to the US, and vice versa. Obviously, those smartphones and laptops are exempt from those tariffs, which is another sign of Apple's political clout. But it's quite extraordinary, really, when it's not as if this has come out of a clear blue sky. I mean, this has been in the works for a while. How would you sort of explain Apple's reluctance to prepare for that?
Yeah, I think they have an understanding that, nobody knows the complexity of building iPhones like Apple does. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I don't think, the media always gets is just how massive the quantities that Apple is working in are, right? So at peak season, Apple is shipping 1 million iPhones a day. Each iPhone has 1,000 parts inside. So that's doing the logistics, manufacturing, the just-in-time production of 1 billion parts a day. It doesn't matter how well Apple understands how to do that. The only place to execute on that scale for all those different components is China. Mm-hmm. So great, you can ship a sub-assembled iPhone to India and put the final touches on it, in Karnataka. You don't have the depth and breadth of everything else, multiple tiers down. And, Apple issues this supply chain list each year. And it says something like, these are our top 200 suppliers, and it accounts for 98% of direct spend. Even investment banks are kind of fooled by this, and they think, oh, okay, so Apple has about 200 suppliers in China. Apple has 6 times that many suppliers in China. They're just not first tier suppliers. Apple goes down multiple tiers. So, they are working on making sure that they have the raw minerals to supply factories that make components that go so to supply the next factory. And this is born out of like 2 things. One, a company like Foxconn will do something called PPV, product price variance, where they bill Apple $1 for each component, but actually they bought it for 30 cents and they're just making 70% margin on that product. And once Apple sort of caught wind of that in the late 2000s, they sort of disintermediated Foxconn and began doing the negotiation for parts that Foxconn needed on its behalf, right? So Apple takes such unprecedented control of its supply chain that it often knows the cost of operations better than the very suppliers who are performing those operations. So that's one crazy thing. The other thing is they just couldn't rely, once volumes got into the tens of millions of iPhones, they couldn't rely on suppliers to, just like actually fulfill the orders that Apple needed. And so Apple's own massive negotiating team just made damn sure through ironclad contracts that they were going to get everything they needed, right? If you have 990 of the 1,000 parts for an iPhone, you don't have an iPhone. And so Apple couldn't just sort of trust that suppliers were going to do right. So they took really great control. And so my point is, the more you understand the complexity of all of this, the more you understand just how difficult it would be to replicate it someplace else. And it's a little bit like, are you supposed to take half? Are you supposed to take a quarter and do some of it in India? Like, what do you do? How do you replicate what you've been doing for a quarter century in a place that operates at what people call China's speed, at a place that has increasing automation and expertise and experiential know-how? And of course, when Apple has been trying to do this in India, Beijing doesn't hand out visas to the Chinese experts that it needs to have go work and live in India for a while. It's putting blockers on your ability to take the machinery now made in China on the production line and get that over to India. So I mean, wow, are they in a quandary? Again, there's just no easy answer here.
Fascinating. And I think we can. I was going to ask you about the the idea that seems to be still exists in parts of the Trump administration, that they could bring manufacturing of iPhones back to the US. But I think, actually, given the answer you just given, we don't even really need to dwell on that very much.
To be honest, to do that, we have to rely on 3 to 4 week old quotes, because they've basically shut up about that. I think they were given a crash course, maybe by Tim Cook, maybe by someone else,
right?
And why that's a total fantasy and it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And so hence the reversal on tariffs on iPhones. So now we have this totally strategically naked situation where, kitchenware, action figures, and bedding coming from China is all subject to 145% tariffs. But iPhones, places where there is a sort of blurry line between electronics, let's say, and military weaponry, places where you do want America to be more involved in the manufacturing, that is not quite tariff-free because of the 20% tariff related to fentanyl, but basically tariff-free. So it's a ridiculous situation that the Trump administration has put the economy in.
Yeah. Well, but also evidence of the clout that Apple has in Washington as well.
I question that because someone familiar with the operations just could have made it clear, look, the reason why Apple is down $800 billion over the last 3 or 4 days, I am sort of going back a month or two, is because this is never going to happen. And Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, is looking like an embarrassing fool for talking about iPhone production happening in America with millions of people, turning in little screws or whatever. I don't think you had to be Apple to make that point. So I'm really unclear as to whether or not that was Apple directly or, frankly, a couple of supply chain experts. Frankly, Elon Musk could have made that lesson. Right. So I'm just hesitant to give Apple credit for something where there's not actual reporting yet on who convinced the White House that iPhone tariffs were a terrible idea.
Okay, fair point. Yeah. Maybe just as a way to wrap this up, I think you talked a lot about Apple's dependence on China. It's also quite clear that China's quite dependent on Apple. I think you have a figure somewhere in the book about Apple sort of supporting 5 million jobs or something like that in China.
That's a number from Apple, maybe worth saying. 3 million manufacturing jobs, 2 million developers for iOS apps and so forth.
That's a huge footprint. So is there a sense there also that their fates are sort of inextricably bound, as you say, but it's not necessarily the case that China can just sort of dispense with Apple at some point?
Yeah, there's lots of bad consequences to kicking Apple out of the country. And not a lot of upside. If you understand that Apple is like the great teacher of the Chinese electronics industry, offering, in a sense, tuition-free but equivalent to the Ivy League hardware engineering to literally millions of people, why would you want to halt that? I don't think you would. So Apple, to some extent, you could say is sort of safe there, except that what we've seen is that when Beijing wants to get rid of VPNs in the country, wants to ban the New York Times app on the mainland and so forth, Apple doesn't really have the political capital to expend and fight those issues. So they've had to sort of acquiesce. Apple does, in fact, have a joint venture these days, right? The joint venture is for data collection and localization in the country. So something that was anathema to them in 2013 ends up being the reality by, I believe, 2018, possibly 2017. So yeah, I don't think it's as mutually symbiotic, to quote Tim Cook, as he likes to say. I don't know that Apple really has leverage against China in any real way, but it does support a lot of jobs. It absolutely supports a lot of innovation. And you think of something like the Vision Pro headset, that's all being assembled by Luxshare, sort of Chinese rival to Taiwan's Foxconn. And the Taiwanese are really being squeezed out. If you were talking about Apple 10 years ago, you'd have a lot to say about Pegatron, Wistron, Quanta. These were all the big Taiwanese suppliers operating on the mainland. And, Foxconn is still a big beast for Apple. The other companies' business have sort of withered away. And in some cases, they've even sold their factories to Luxshare and others in the quote unquote red supply chain. It's a great question and something to think about as to whether Apple really has political clout in Beijing. But I think it's more obvious the other way. And I can't point to really anything where Apple needed something and Beijing lost face, but accepted it, because it was good for the business and they worried about Apple moving. I think they know that they've got Apple over a barrel. Okay.
Well, I think that's probably as good a place as any to leave it. We could talk for much longer, Patrick, but this has been a really fascinating quick whistle-stop tour of what has clearly been a lot of research and a lot of reporting. So, fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat to us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Peter.
That's all we have time for this week. Thanks to Patrick for that fascinating discussion. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app, or your favourite platform. Don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. Reuters World News, your daily dose of the biggest global stories, and Reuters Econ World, a weekly deep dive into economic concepts behind the headlines. If you like what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.